I signed the divorce papers. And that was the exact moment my husband thought he had already won, but what he didn't realize was that everything he believed about our marriage, our money, and especially me was about to unravel in ways he never saw coming, and honestly, that's exactly how I needed it to be, because if there's one thing I learned after 10 years of marriage to Ryan Bennett, it's that he only ever paid attention to what was right in front of him, never what was quietly happening behind the scenes, and that blind spot of his was about to cost him more than he could imagine. It started on a Tuesday evening, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just the kind of normal night where you expect dinner, maybe a conversation, maybe silence, but instead Ryan walked in, placed a thin stack of papers on the kitchen counter like it was nothing more than a receipt and said, "I want a divorce," just like that, no hesitation, no build-up, and before I could even process the words, he added, almost casually, "I've already spoken to a lawyer, and based on how everything is structured, I'll be keeping the house, the accounts, basically everything." And I remember standing there, my hand still resting on a coffee mug that had gone cold, trying to understand how the man I built a life with could reduce everything we had into a transaction he had already decided the outcome of. He talked like it was already done, like I was just a step in a process he had mapped out weeks ago, maybe months, and the confidence in his voice wasn't just confidence, it was certainty, the kind that comes from thinking you're in complete control. And I won't lie, in that moment I let him believe it. I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel like I was overwhelmed, like I didn't know what to do, because that's exactly what he expected. He had always seen me as the one who followed, the one who trusted, the one who didn't question things like bank statements or legal terms or why certain accounts were suddenly just easier for him to manage alone. And standing there, I realized something very clearly. He wasn't asking for a divorce, he was executing a plan, one that depended on me reacting exactly the way he assumed I would, shocked, emotional, unprepared, and most importantly, compliant. So when I finally picked up the papers and flipped through them, keeping my expression neutral, he mistook my calm for surrender. He even leaned back slightly like the outcome was already sealed. And that's when I looked up and said, "Okay." Just one word, simple, quiet, controlled, and I watched the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his entire posture shifted into relief, because to him that word meant he had already taken everything from me. But what he didn't understand, not yet, was that I had already seen this coming long before he ever walked through that door. And by the time he placed those papers in front of me, the version of the story he thought he was writing was already slipping out of his hands. The truth is, Ryan did not wake up one day and suddenly decide to end our marriage. People like him do not make impulsive moves when money is involved. They plan, they calculate, and they move when they believe every possible outcome is already in their favor. And that is exactly what he thought he had done. But what he never considered was that I had been noticing the small shifts long before he ever said the word divorce. It started with things that were easy to dismiss at first, late nights at the office that did not quite match his usual schedule, calls he would step outside to take, passwords quietly changed without explanation. And then the financial changes, those were the ones that mattered, statements no longer arriving at the house, accounts he insisted were just easier for him to manage alone. And at first I told myself it was normal, that maybe I was overthinking, but there is a difference between trust and ignoring patterns, and once I saw the pattern I could not unsee it. So instead of confronting him, instead of reacting the way he expected, I did something he would never imagine me doing. I started paying attention in silence. I made copies of everything I could access. I reviewed tax returns, I tracked account numbers. I learned more about our finances in 3 months than I had in 10 years of marriage, and the more I looked, the clearer it became that Ryan was not just preparing for a divorce, he was restructuring our entire financial life in a way that would leave me with almost nothing if I stayed unaware. And that was the moment everything shifted for me, not emotionally but strategically, because I realized that reacting too early would only give him time to adjust, to hide things better, to close whatever gaps I had already started to see. So I stayed quiet. I let him think I was still the same version of me he had always relied on, the one who trusted without question, the one who did not look too closely. And while he was busy building his version of the future, I started building mine. I reached out to a lawyer, not dramatically, not urgently, but carefully, someone who understood complex financial situations, someone who knew exactly what to look for when assets did not line up the way they should. And I remember sitting in that office, sliding a folder across the desk filled with documents I had gathered piece by piece, and watching the expression on her face change as she reviewed them. It was not shock, it was recognition, like she had seen this kind of situation before. And when she finally looked up at me, she did not ask if I was sure about what I suspected. She simply said, "You did the right thing by coming in before signing anything." And that sentence alone told me everything I needed to know, because it meant I was not imagining it. It meant there was more beneath the surface than Ryan believed I would ever discover. And from that point on, every step I took was intentional, every reaction measured, every word chosen carefully, because I understood something he did not. This was no longer about saving a marriage, it was about protecting myself from a plan that was already in motion. And by the time he placed those papers in front of me and spoke with that calm certainty, he thought he was several steps ahead, but in reality, he had already walked into a situation where I was no longer playing by the rules he had set. I was simply letting him believe that I was. After that meeting, everything became clearer, not in a dramatic way, not like something suddenly exploded into chaos, but in a quiet, controlled clarity that changed how I saw every single interaction with Ryan from that point forward. Because once you understand that someone has already been planning against you, you stop reacting emotionally and start observing strategically. And that is exactly what I did. I went home that evening and nothing on the surface had changed. Ryan still moved through the house with that same calm confidence, still spoke like everything was already settled, still acted like I was just another detail he had already accounted for. And I let him believe that. I let my routine stay the same. I did not question him, I did not confront him, I did not even hint that I knew more than I should, because the most valuable position I had at that moment was invisibility, and the more comfortable he felt, the more careless he became, and that carelessness showed up in small but important ways: a document left open on his laptop for a few seconds too long, a phone call where he assumed I was not paying attention, a transfer confirmation email that he did not realize I could still access through a shared backup account. And each of those moments added another piece to a much larger picture, one that confirmed what my lawyer had already suspected, that Ryan had been moving assets in ways that were meant to minimize what I would be entitled to, not illegally in an obvious way but strategically, quietly, and over time. And that kind of pattern does not hold up well when someone is actually looking for it, especially someone who now knows exactly where to look. So I documented everything, every date, every amount, every account number. I created a timeline that mapped out not just what he did, but when he started doing it, and that timeline told a story he never expected anyone else to read, because it showed that his decision to end the marriage did not come first, the financial restructuring did, and that detail mattered more than he realized, because it changed the narrative from a simple separation to something much more calculated. And while he was focused on the outcome he wanted, I was focused on the sequence of events that would prove how he got there. And that difference in focus was everything, because one is based on assumption, and the other is based on evidence, and evidence does not rely on who speaks louder or who appears more confident, it relies on what can be shown. And by the time Ryan handed me those papers and spoke with that same steady tone, I had already built something far stronger than he anticipated. I had a documented pattern, a legal strategy, and most importantly, timing, because my lawyer made one thing very clear to me: the moment I signed those papers would not be the end of anything, it would be the beginning of a process where everything he thought was hidden would be examined. And that was the moment I understood exactly how this would play out, not through confrontation, not through arguments, but through patience and precision. So when I stood there in the kitchen holding those papers and said, okay, it was not agreement, it was alignment with a plan he did not know existed. And as he watched me sign, believing he had just secured his outcome, I realized something almost ironic: the more confident he became in that moment, the less control he actually had. Because he was stepping forward into a situation where the version of me he thought he understood no longer existed, and by the time he realized that, it would already be too late to adjust anything he had set in motion. The next morning felt almost ordinary, and that was the strangest part of all, because when something this significant is happening beneath the surface, you expect the world to feel different, heavier somehow, but instead everything looked exactly the same. The sunlight came through the kitchen window the same way it always did, the coffee maker clicked on at the same time, and Ryan moved through the house with the same steady rhythm he had built over the years, except now I could see the difference, not in what he did but in what he assumed, because he no longer saw me as part of the equation, he saw me as something that had already been resolved, and that shift gave me an advantage he did not even recognize. He did not ask me how I felt, he did not check in, he did not hesitate, he simply continued forward like the outcome was guaranteed. And I matched that energy in the only way that mattered: by staying calm, by staying consistent, by giving him no reason to question anything. And over the next few days, I watched how quickly he settled into that belief, how easily he adapted to the idea that everything was already under his control, and the more comfortable he became, the more he revealed without realizing it, small details at first, like mentioning timelines that did not match what he had told me before, or referencing conversations with his lawyer as if they were already final. And then larger things, like discussing future plans for the house as if I would not be part of that. conversation at all, and every time he spoke with that certainty it confirmed something important. He was not preparing for a negotiation, he was preparing for a conclusion. And that kind of mindset leaves very little room for adjustment when new information enters the situation, especially information he does not expect. And that is exactly what was coming, because behind the scenes, everything had already started moving. My lawyer had begun formal steps that Ryan did not know about yet. Requests were being prepared, documents were being reviewed, and most importantly, the financial timeline I had built was being translated into something that could not be ignored, something structured, something precise, something that would force attention where he had assumed there would be none. And during that time, I kept my role exactly the same in his eyes. I responded when necessary, I stayed neutral, I did not challenge him, because the goal was never to alert him, the goal was to let him continue exactly as he was, because every step he took under that assumption strengthened the position I was building. And I remember one evening in particular, he sat across from me at the kitchen table scrolling through something on his phone, and he said almost casually, "Once this is finalized, I will probably refinance the house, it just makes more sense that way." And I nodded slightly, not because I agreed, but because I understood what that statement represented. It was not just a plan, it was an expectation, one built on the belief that everything was already decided. And in that moment I realized just how far ahead he thought he was, and how completely unaware he remained of what was already unfolding, because what he saw as the final stage was actually just the beginning. And the more he spoke about the future with that level of certainty, the more I understood that when the reality finally reached him, it would not just challenge his expectations, it would completely disrupt them, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a way that would force him to stop and reevaluate everything he thought he had secured. And as I sat there listening, responding just enough to maintain the illusion, I knew that moment was getting closer, and when it arrived, it would not come with warning, it would come with clarity, the kind that cannot be ignored or explained away, the kind that shifts everything in an instant. And by then there would be nothing left for him to control except how he reacted to a situation he no longer understood. By the end of that week, everything had reached a point where nothing more needed to be guessed, nothing more needed to be interpreted, because the process had already begun moving forward in ways that Ryan could no longer control, even though he still believed he was the one directing it. And that contrast between what he believed and what was actually happening was becoming sharper with every passing day, because while he was focusing on outcomes, assuming everything would unfold exactly as he had planned, I was watching the structure around him begin to shift, quietly, methodically, and without any need for confrontation. And the first real sign of that shift came in a way he did not expect, not through an argument, not through anything emotional, but through something far more difficult to dismiss, a formal request, structured, documented, and precise, one that required full financial disclosure, not partial, not selective, but complete. And when that request entered the process, it changed the entire dynamic instantly, because everything he had been managing quietly now had to be accounted for in a way that could be reviewed, verified, and compared against the timeline that had already been built. And I remember the exact moment he realized something was different. It was subtle, just a slight pause in his voice when he mentioned that his lawyer needed additional information, a slight shift in his tone when he asked if I had spoken to anyone, and I kept my response simple, controlled, just enough to answer without revealing anything, because at that point the process was no longer dependent on what either of us said, it was moving forward on its own. And that is what made it so effective, because it did not rely on emotion, it relied on structure. And structure does not adjust based on confidence or assumptions, it adjusts based on facts. And the more those facts began to surface, the more I could see the difference in him, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, telling ways. He started asking more questions, not directly, but indirectly, trying to understand what had changed, trying to find where the shift had come from. And for the first time since he had placed those papers in front of me, there was something missing from his voice, that certainty, that absolute belief that everything was already secured. It was still there on the surface, but underneath it there was hesitation, and hesitation only appears when something no longer aligns with expectation. And that was exactly what was happening, because the narrative he had built for himself depended on one key assumption: that I would not know enough, that I would not act early enough, and most importantly, that I would not challenge the structure he had put in place. And now, without me ever raising my voice, without any confrontation, that assumption was beginning to collapse. And as it did, the space he had been operating in started to narrow, because every new piece of information that had to be disclosed created a connection to something else. Every account led to another account. Every transfer pointed back to a pattern, and patterns are very difficult to explain away when they are laid out clearly over time. And I could see it in the way he carried himself, still composed, still controlled, but no longer entirely certain. And that was the moment I understood something important, This was not about catching him off guard in a dramatic sense. This was about allowing the reality of the situation to unfold in a way that he could not redirect, and the more he tried to maintain the image of control, the more obvious it became that the situation was no longer responding to him the way he expected. And as that realization started to take shape, I stayed exactly where I needed to be, calm, steady, and completely aligned with a process that was already moving forward, because at this point nothing needed to be forced, nothing needed to be accelerated. Everything was already happening at the exact pace required. And the only thing left was for him to fully understand what that meant. Something that was getting closer with every step. He could no longer undo. It was not a single moment that changed everything. It was a series of small realizations stacking on top of each other until even Ryan could no longer ignore what was happening, because once the formal disclosures began, the situation stopped being something he could manage privately and became something that required consistency. And consistency is where carefully constructed plans start to break down when they are not built to withstand scrutiny. And I could see it in the way he started double-checking things, in the way he spent longer hours reviewing documents, in the way his tone shifted from confident to controlled. And there is a difference between those two. Confidence is effortless, but control requires effort, and effort means something is no longer aligning the way it should. And one evening, as he sat across from me again, there was a pause before he spoke, a brief hesitation that had never been there before, and he said, "There are a few things my lawyer needs clarification on." And the way he phrased it was careful, neutral, but underneath it there was something else, something searching, like he was trying to understand how certain details had come into question in the first place. And I responded the same way I had been responding the entire time, calm, minimal, without giving him anything he could use to piece together the full picture, because by then the process was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It was revealing connections he had assumed would never be examined together. It was aligning timelines he thought were separate, and most importantly, it was creating a structure where every explanation had to match the evidence. And that is where things began to tighten around him, not in a dramatic way but in a precise one, because each time something did not fully align, it required further clarification, and each clarification led to another detail, another connection, another point that could not be ignored. And I remember the first time he asked me directly, "Have you been looking into the accounts?" And it was subtle, almost casual, but it was the first time he stepped outside of the narrative he had been maintaining, the first time he acknowledged that something might not be unfolding the way he expected. And I held his gaze just long enough to let the moment settle before answering simply, "I have been reviewing what I have access to." And that answer was true, but it was also incomplete, and he knew it, not because I said anything revealing, but because the situation itself was starting to reveal more than either of us needed to say out loud. And from that point on, the dynamic shifted again, not entirely, not openly, but enough to be noticeable. He became more measured in what he shared, more cautious in how he moved. But by then, caution did not change the structure that was already in motion. It only confirmed that he was beginning to understand it. And understanding, even partial understanding, changes everything. Because once you realize you are not in control, every step feels different, every decision carries weight, and every assumption becomes something you question instead of rely on. And I could see that process beginning in him, slow, controlled, but undeniable. And at the same time, everything on my side continued forward exactly as planned, every document aligned, every timeline remained consistent, every piece of information reinforced the same pattern. And that consistency is what gave the entire situation its strength, because while his position relied on maintaining a specific version of events, mine relied on demonstrating what had actually happened over time. And those are not equal, one can be adjusted, the other cannot. And as that difference became clearer, the space he had been operating in continued to narrow, because there were fewer and fewer ways to explain what was being uncovered without contradicting something else. And contradiction is something the process does not overlook, it highlights it, it holds on to it, and it requires it to be addressed. And that is where the real shift was happening, not in what was being said between us, but in what was being established beyond those conversations. And as I watched that unfold, I stayed exactly where I needed to be, steady, patient, and fully aware that the moment where everything became undeniable was no longer something in the distance. It was approaching, and when it arrived, it would not require any explanation from me at all. The shift became undeniable the day the full financial summary was formally assembled, not just as scattered documents or isolated transactions, but as a complete, structured narrative that showed everything in sequence, because when individual actions are placed side by side over time, they stop looking like coincidences and start forming a pattern that cannot be easily explained away. And that was exactly what had been built. A timeline that connected decisions, transfers, and changes in a way that removed ambiguity and replaced it with clarity. And when that level of clarity enters a situation like this, it does not create noise, it creates silence, the kind of silence that forces attention. And I remember sitting in the office again, reviewing the final compilation with my lawyer, watching as each section reinforced the same conclusion, that what Ryan had been doing was not random, not reactive, but intentional, and more importantly, traceable. And once something becomes traceable, it becomes accountable, and accountability changes the entire direction of a process, because it no longer revolves around assumptions, it revolves around verification, and verification leaves very little room for interpretation. And that was the moment everything moved from preparation into execution, because now there was nothing left to build, nothing left to gather, everything was already in place, and all that remained was for it to be presented within the process that Ryan had initiated, the same process he believed would secure his position. And the irony of that was something I understood very clearly, because the structure he relied on was the same structure that would now require him to answer for everything he had set in motion. And when that transition happened, it did not come with an announcement, it came through procedure, through formal communication, through steps that could not be bypassed or ignored. And I saw the moment it reached him, not directly, not through words, but through his reaction, the way he stood still for just a second longer than usual, the way his expression tightened slightly before returning to neutral, the way his voice, when he finally spoke, carried a level of control that was no longer effortless, and he said, "There are some discrepancies they are asking about." And even in that sentence there was an attempt to minimize what was happening, to frame it as something small, something manageable, but the word discrepancies carries weight, because it means something does not align, and when multiple discrepancies appear across a structured timeline, they do not remain isolated, they connect, and when they connect they form a pattern that requires explanation. And that was the position he now found himself in, not one of control but one of response, and response is a very different place to operate from, because it means you are no longer setting the direction, you are adjusting to it. And as he moved through that realization, I remained exactly where I had been from the beginning, steady, composed, and aligned with a process that no longer depended on anything I said or did in the moment, because everything that mattered had already been established. And as the days continued, the difference between us became even more clear. He was trying to maintain a version of events that no longer held together the way it once did, while I was simply allowing the established facts to move forward on their own. And facts, once structured and presented, do not require reinforcement, they hold their position, they remain consistent, and that consistency is what makes them so difficult to challenge. And I could see the weight of that consistency beginning to settle in, not all at once but gradually, in the way he paused more often, in the way he chose his words more carefully, in the way he no longer spoke about outcomes with the same certainty. And that was when I knew we had reached the point where everything he had built his confidence on was no longer enough to support it, because once certainty is replaced with doubt, even in small amounts, it changes how every next step feels, and from that point forward, nothing about his position would ever feel as secure as it once did. No matter how much he tried to hold on to it, by the time everything was formally laid out, there was no longer any space for interpretation, no room for assumptions, because what had once been separate pieces were now connected in a way that made the full picture impossible to ignore. And that was when the real shift happened, not just in the process but in Ryan himself, because up until that point, he had been operating under the belief that he could still manage the situation, still adjust, still guide the outcome in his favor. But once the full scope of the financial timeline was presented, that belief began to break down in ways he could not control, and I saw it clearly in the way he approached me one evening, not with the same certainty he had before, but with something more restrained, more careful, like he was measuring every word before saying it. And he asked, "Why are they focusing on transactions from last year?" And that question alone revealed everything, because it meant he knew exactly which parts of his actions were now under scrutiny, and more importantly, it meant he was trying to understand how those parts had been brought into focus in the first place. And I answered him the same way I had answered every question since this began, calm, steady, without giving him anything beyond what was already obvious. They are reviewing the full financial history. And I watched as that answer settled in, because there was nothing in it he could challenge, nothing he could redirect. It was simple, factual, and aligned with the process itself, and that is what made it so effective, because once the process reaches that level, it no longer depends on explanations between two people. It operates independently, guided by documentation, timelines, and consistency, and those are not things that can be easily reshaped once they are established. And from that point forward, every step he took was no longer about maintaining control, it was about limiting impact, and those are two very different positions to be in because control is proactive but limitation is reactive, and reactive positions always carry pressure because they require constant adjustment, constant awareness, and constant effort. And I could see that effort in everything he did, in the way he reviewed documents late into the night, in the way he paused before responding to emails, in the way his conversations became shorter, more focused, less certain, and all of those changes pointed to the same reality. The situation was no longer unfolding the way he had planned, and more importantly, he was beginning to understand that he could not reverse it, because the structure was already in place, the timeline had already been established, and the connections between each action had already been documented. And once that level of structure exists, it does not disappear, it does not shift based on preference, it remains consistent, and consistency is what gives it strength, because it means every new detail must align with what is already known. And when something does not align, it stands out immediately, and that is where his position continued to weaken, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through the simple fact that his version of events required flexibility, while the documented version required consistency, and those two cannot coexist for long. And as that gap widened, the outcome became less about what either of us wanted and more about what the evidence supported. And evidence does not negotiate, it does not adjust to expectation, it holds its position. And as I moved through those final stages, I understood something very clearly. This was no longer about proving anything. It was about allowing what had already been established to speak for itself, and the more that happened, the less there was for me to do, because everything that mattered had already been set into motion, and all that remained was for the final pieces to fall into place, something that was now closer than ever, and something Ryan could no longer avoid, no matter how much he tried to regain the certainty he once had. By the time we reached the final stage of the process, there was nothing left that needed to be uncovered, nothing left that needed to be explained, because everything had already been placed exactly where it needed to be, and the outcome was no longer something uncertain or negotiable, it was something that had been built step by step through consistency, documentation, and timing. And what made that moment so different from where this all started was not just the shift in position, but the complete reversal of understanding between us, because Ryan, who once spoke with absolute certainty about how everything would end, now moved carefully, deliberately, choosing each word with a level of caution that had never been there before. And I could see it clearly when we sat down one last time across from each other in a setting that felt far more formal than anything we had shared before. And for the first time, he did not begin the conversation with assumptions, he began with questions, measured, controlled, but undeniably different, and he said, "So this is how it is going to be finalized," not as a statement but as a confirmation, as if he needed to hear it out loud to fully accept it. And I nodded slightly, not because I needed to assert anything, but because at that point everything that needed to be said had already been established through the process itself. And what followed was not dramatic, it was not emotional, it was precise, structured, and clear, the kind of clarity that does not leave space for interpretation, because every decision reflected what had been demonstrated over time, every allocation aligned with the documented timeline, and every outcome was supported by the consistency that had been maintained from the very beginning. And as those final details were reviewed, I noticed something that would have been easy to miss if I had not been paying attention: the absence of resistance, not complete acceptance, but the absence of the certainty he once had, because there was nothing left to challenge in a meaningful way, nothing left that could be reshaped to fit the narrative he had originally built. And that is what happens when a situation moves from assumption to verification. The space for control disappears, and what remains is simply the reality of what has been established. And as that reality settled in, the dynamic between us reached its final form, no longer defined by imbalance, no longer shaped by what one person believed they could take, but defined by what had actually been proven. And in that moment I realized something that went far beyond the outcome itself. This was never about reacting to what he did, it was about understanding it early enough to respond in a way that changed everything. And that difference, the difference between reacting and responding, is what made all of this possible, because while he focused on securing an outcome, I focused on understanding the process that would determine it. And in the end, the process is what decides everything, not confidence, not assumptions, not even intentions, but what can be shown, what can be connected, and what can remain consistent under scrutiny. And as we stood up to leave, with everything finalized in a way that reflected exactly that, there was no need for closure through words, no need for acknowledgement, because the outcome itself had already said everything that needed to be said. And as I stepped forward into what came next, I did not feel like I had won something from him. I felt like I had taken back something that had quietly been slipping away long before he ever placed those papers on the table. And this time there was nothing uncertain about where I stood. Nothing left that depended on what someone else believed, because everything was now built on something far more stable than that, something that could not be undone once it had been established, and that is what made the difference in the end.